Susan Howe very much regrets that she can't be here, and even seconds ago I got a slight alteration in what she sent me. She is here, just not in body, and very powerful memories for her that we're being together bring to mind. So she's asked me to read this statement or comment of hers. When I was at UB, the university had a strong Americanist presence in the English department, due partly to Ken Dauber, Leslie Fiedler, and Neil Schmitz. The president of the university, William Greiner, was sympathetic and smart in his choices. Robert Berthoff was the curator of the poetry collection at that time, and he was wonderfully generous to me and many other people in the graduate program. Then there was Deidre Lynch, an 18th centuryist, Carol Jacobs and Henry Sussman in comparative literature, Rita Lipsitz, our beloved department secretary, and Joan Kopchak, then director of the Center for the Study of Psychoanalysis and Culture, and Claire Kahane. I came into a scholarly community that made me feel welcome and inspired by, and into a conversation that ranged across disciplines. Often my fondest memories of the Poetics program, in particular during the late 1980s and 90s, with its ambitions, furies, hilarities, criticisms, enthusiasms, and disjunctive leaps, are centered around the Firehouse on the corner of Amherst and East Street, where the Creeleys lived. I cannot think of Robert Creeley without Penelope Creeley, because at that time they operated almost as one person, though both of them would probably disapprove of my saying that. Their home was an imposing structure designed in the arts and crafts style, with the Italianate addition of a tower that was built in 1912 during Buffalo's glory days. Engine number 15 is engraved in the stone over the keystone of the elaborate sandstone entrance, surround on the Amherst side, used by the Creeley family as a garage and mudroom. I remember when Will got his license, Penelope bought the family a Jeep that seemed more like a tank. We entered through the East Street door. Once inside, a stairway led to the central living area. On the wall at the top, a framed 8-foot-tall portrait of Lord Byron against a blue background fading to orange. I think it was a poster Robert Indiana had designed for an opera house in Santa Fe. The author of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and close friend of the Shelleys, George Gordon Lord Byron, English romantic poet and man of the world, who risked everything, including himself, majestically, capriciously indifferent, faced me down as I climbed up. So many evenings, so many assortment of visitors gathered in this open room, with Bob at the end of the long dining table, students and visiting poets gathered around, Penny providing endless quantities of food, and other visitors bringing wine and other stimulants. Possibly when Warren Tallman was in town, some table tapping and spirit rapping. I think of the Firehouse as a domestic but rebellious force inside framed fields. It was good to come into, to return, in Robert Duncan's sense of poetry, as a common property open to experiment and risk at the same time, teaching, never forgetting invisible spirits roaming through other pilgrimages and passages on the way to whatever new spells and promises. Robert Creeley and Robert Duncan made us poets believe in the political urgency of our task, not in a capitalist sense, but to a return to sharing independence. He was an American poet, one who wrote with a sense of urgency and history at once, and one who believed in what Hart Crane called in his great final poem, the broken tower, the visionary company of love. And so it was I entered the broken world to trace the visionary company of love. Its voice, an instant in the wind, I know not whither hurled, but not for long to hold each desperate choice. Robert Creeley believed in this visionary company, a sense of community, a community of poets that shared a long literary history. Poets as pilgrims, each word is desperate. That's what's so American about his work, in a way, and what we had at the University at Buffalo provided in those years. One of Robert's earliest poems, Heart Crane for Slater Brown, acknowledges Crane's last magnificent, The Broken Tower. And then this is the quote from Bob's poem. The head could not go further without those friends. And so it was I entered the broken world. Heart Crane. Heart, spelled H-A-R-T. The brilliant last name of the word in italic, such a Creeley touch. Just heart in italic at the end. Such a Creeley touch. Hesitation or stutter in the space of the beating heart of the matter. I hope Charles will read this poem. I love Penn so much, and I felt she was such a loyal friend. During the last few years, she and I used to moan by phone to each other after mornings and after the PBS NewsHour the night before. What would Robert be saying now? I would answer with, what would Daddy be saying now? My father was a civil rights lawyer, and he had once been dean at the very left-leaning Buffalo Law School until Pearl Harbor, when he joined the Army and we moved away. Now my sister, Fanny Howe, also a friend of Penn's, has left us. She was born in Buffalo's Children's Hospital in 1941. So I hope Charles will read as our last shot Robert's Angry America, You Ode for Reality, which I will do. America, you ode for reality. Give back the people you took. Let the sun shine again on the four corners of the world. You thought of first, but do not own or keep like a convenience. People are your own word. You invented that locus and term. Here, you said and say, is where we are. Give back what we are. These people you made, us, and nowhere but you to be.
Yeah.
So really, Susan is with us, and always with me when I'm in Buffalo. We're going to each now speak. I'll introduce each person first. To my immediate right, Elizabeth Willis. She has her PhD from the Poetics program in 1993, though she originally came to UB in the 1980s. Her most recent work is called Lion Taming in America, New Directions 2024. You can get it at Talking Leaves Books.
My
my first few years in Buffalo, I sat in the back rows of hundreds of poetry readings at Just Buffalo, at hall walls, at UB's poetry collection, in student living rooms, and in the back room of the bar next to the Trico plant, the Central Park Grill, where the second or third reader of the evening had to compete with the sound of air hockey in the front room, just as the shifts changed. Each of these contexts was instructive in its own way, immersed as they were in different forms of labor: factory line work, community outreach, interdisciplinary art and performance, and the work of scholars and archivists. All of these were contexts for the making of poetry. And I would run into Bob in these classrooms as much as I did in Capen Hall. This made sense to me. I had worked odd jobs to pay my way through college and had no sense that poetry was or could be any kind of profession. And curiously, I never thought of Bob as my professor, although, of course, he was. What we did in class, we did together. We observed language. We read poems and we spoke about what we saw and heard and felt. Bob's seminars were punctuated with familiar, repetitive actions that often somehow were lessons about time, immersed in the ways that poetry is entangled with the quotidian, the habitual, and the revelatory. In the first course I took with Bob, he had recently quit smoking, but it was clear that the ritual of smoking was fully integrated into years of reading, writing, and thinking. So he was often patting his pockets, as people do when they're feeling for a pack of cigarettes. But it was also this reminder of the physicality of the person who was speaking. And since there were no rules against smoking in class at that time, several of the aspiring young men in the front row would almost immediately offer him whatever they had that could be set on fire. There would be another round of pocket patting before the offering of a book of matches. It was a practice that was highly routinized and that seemed to happen in every class session as if for the first time, like just discovering you don't have cigarettes. But I don't think it was either purely intentional or unconscious. It was, or I perceived it to be, the enactment of a particular kind of edge, of desire and shared permission, and something like the ancient intimacy of sitting around a fire. There was a pause when both cigarette and match were in hand. There was a pause after that when the match had been lit before it touched the tip of the cigarette, and that felt like it went on forever. Whatever it was he was saying, what he was saying was, "Here we are. Are you with me?" The institutional quotidian, class begins now and ends then, would always palpably abut the human quotidian. Is he going to burn his fingers? And there was the situation of time among us in the form of poetry, the expanded field of time that includes echoes from as far back as the beginnings of language. Fire is an agent of irreversible direction. Poetry and thought are in a different time than the cigarette, but these are adjoining moments that echo and reiterate each other, just as they reiterate the social formation of the moment. In a poem or a conversation, the movie can run backwards. A word can be haunted by its own echoes. A comment can be paternal or impish. We are here to share something curious in our shared curiosity. Likewise, the space of his talks and lectures were, as I think most of us in this room have experienced, looping, reiterative, digressive, in the most liberating and instructional of ways. If we wanted to learn something, we had to follow. Classic, characteristic, common, peculiar, particular, fact. Things, behaviors, thoughts, ways of speaking could be viewed and perhaps better understood according to the ways they bolster or deviate from certain social, behavioral, and aesthetic norms. One is neither inherently better nor worse than the other. The common, for instance, was a condition of great value, as too was the peculiar, the particular, and the characteristic. All that an individual is not discretely their own, but most of it is, like genetic material, deeply and profoundly shared. Classic was a way of invoking a pattern language, a historical or mythic sense of some norm, like the classic boy and girl of the scene, from which we were welcome to deviate. The momentary alignment of the common and the idiosyncratically particular could be, in the language of both manners and enchantment, charming. I think this is connected with the ways Bob would deflate any moment of potential grandiosity, tempering it with the kind of self-deprecation that represented a larger philosophical choice, an insistence on decommodifying even such a thing as a poetry reading or a class session. You had to be at the edge with him, as whatever he was doing or saying was unfolding between you. There was a palpable desire that we all be on the same common plane. Whatever presumed authority existed in such a room must be unstable if it was going to do anything. In the early 80s, Bob taught a course on language poetry, not because he had a particular take on it, but because he didn't. And he wanted to discover what he thought about it, and he wanted to do that with us. What a gift that was. The vastness of not knowing is something we can share and something we can work with. And he knew it is infinitely more available to everyone in the room than what he, as the presumed master, could convey. And part of what was instructive was this: it was more interesting for him, too. I don't know what others experienced with Bob in office hours, but when I brought him a poem, his response was never directive or editorial. It always led somewhere else first, and the main content would be the suggestion of other poets I might want to read. The point was always to expand the company, the field of reference, the potential for belonging to a larger conversation, not to polish what one knows, but to reach beyond it. We weren't concerned with craft. We were learning the courage to run headlong into our own difficulties, whatever they were. And let's see, I want to actually just pause to hear Bob's voice in one of his essays from a quick graph called I'm Given to Write Poems. I'm given to write poems. I cannot anticipate their occasion. I have used all the intelligence that I can muster to follow the possibilities that the poem underhand is declaring, but I cannot anticipate the necessary conclusions of the activity, nor can I judge in any sense, in moments of writing, the significance of that writing more than to recognize that it is being permitted to continue. I'm trying to say that in writing, at least as I have experienced it, one is in the activity, and that fact itself is what I feel so deeply as the significance of anything that we call poetry. I'm just going to read one other quick piece. One of the few books I've ever had that was stolen, not by me as it happened, but by a girl I persuaded to steal it for me, was William Carlos Williams' The Wedge. It proved fire of a very real order, and for the record, was subsequently stolen from me in turn when I was teaching at Black Mountain in the mid-1950s. Stolen fire. This is our Promethean inheritance. We must run toward it, even into it. We must return to it. And I just, I want to end quickly, but I want to say that that essay was written in the early 60s. And I have often wondered how much Bob thought later about the fact that he had chosen to live in a firehouse. And I assume that it evoked for him, as it did for me always, the William Carlos Williams poem for Charles Demuth with the number 5, the great figure 5. with all the energy of an emerging reality, as a poet must be given to speeding toward, not away from the difficulties both of one's craft and the ways of living it demands. And I just want to end by saying it's so great and moving that the work that Will is doing now is an organization called FIRE. So more on that.
I would not have come to Buffalo if it hadn't been for Robert Creeley. I was a student of the poet and novelist Gilbert Sorrentino, who had recently arrived in Palo Alto at about the same time that I did in 1982. As someone remarked, Creeley was a habitué of the Cedar Tavern in Lower Manhattan, and that's where he would have found Frank O'Hara, he would have found the painters, he would have found John Ashbery and Gilbert Sorrentino, Leroy Jones, later Amiri Baraka. So there was a connection from the Cedar and Gil's editing of Culture and Neon. They published one another. And while I was at Stanford, which is where I did my graduate work, I also was permitted to attend and contribute to the writing seminars of Denise Levertov. And Denise was mostly engaged with teaching the Stegner Fellows, but on Gil's recommendation, she had given me blessing to submit Louis Zukofsky knockoffs, which she, basically disdained. She said, "Why don't you write more poems like that one about your, grandmother going off to work in the morning?" I said, "Well, all right, Denise, I guess I could do that." So, my experience with Denise was a workshop-based experience. It was great to hear from Steve Fredman earlier this afternoon about the relationship between Creeley and Robert Duncan, who was still a presence even by the mid-1980s in the Bay Area. And I heard and met Robert Duncan on a couple of occasions, and also wrote in that book, Unending Design, about the serial nature of Robert Duncan's, Bob Creeley's, Paul Blackburn's, and other, George Oppen, who had passed away but was a Bay Area poet. And so I was engaged with those poets. Also, I think, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was running City Lights Books in San Francisco. And I like to think that I communed with the ghost of Jack Spicer at Gino and Carlo's bar. I always felt that after a couple of bourbons, you could really just feel that Jack was there with you. He was a habitué of that particular bar. And so when I was hoping to find employment, because it's not really ever a profession, I suppose, I know that the advice of Gil and Denise were significant in allowing me to come to Buffalo. And if it hadn't been for, I think, Bob's insistence, I might not have ever been here. You wonder about, sort of what would have transpired otherwise. And so I arrived, it was like 88, 89, and I had a year as a postdoctoral fellow, and I was settling in. And Bob and Penelope invited me, not to the firehouse, which they hadn't yet bought, but to this sort of Tudor village contraption in the city of Buffalo. Maybe some of you, know where it is. And I thought, oh my God, I've never met in person. I had seen him, at conferences such as the Orono National Poetry Foundation conference. I'd seen him there, but never really interacted with him. And I was pretty nervous about it. And so they invited me to a kind of, lunch, and Will and Hannah were running around in the room. It was great. And I thought, I have to bring something to this. And, I need to bring a gift, right? Because I knew that my very presence in Buffalo was directly related to the endorsement that my work had gotten from Bob. and I found a copy of the collected poems of David Gray. And as some of you know, right, Bob and Charles were the David Gray professors of English letters and poetry. And I read some of it, and, it wasn't bad. It was sort of late 19th century conventional formal verse. David Gray was a contemporary of Samuel Clemens.
That's true.
That's right, and they were both editors at the then Courier Express newspaper, so there's that connection. They were rivals.
So I always get this wrong, but Gray was the editor of the Buffalo Express, and Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens was the paper that later merged, the Buffalo Courier, I believe.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the other way around. And they became
fast friends, rivals and friends.
Yeah, okay.
So I brought this volume, and I thought I have to give the David Gray professor, right, a copy of the volume of David Gray, and he had never seen this before. And he took it, he accepted it, and set it aside because, really it was not part of the company. And then, as I said, I had about a year or so before I was fully in the reins of teaching my own classes. And as Liz has done a wonderful job of describing the atmosphere of those classrooms, what struck me, having done writing seminars with Archie Ammons and John Stallworthy and Denise Levertov and W.S.D. Piero, these were poets whose principal occupation, and maybe cloistered occupation in the academy, was to teach creative writing, right, and really nothing else. And so when I came here, Bob was teaching a seminar. He was teaching the company. And so obviously the students can describe this perhaps better than I can. But it was typically Charles Olson, the New York poets such as Ashbery and O'Hara, certainly Allen Ginsberg, who in '89 paid a visit to the classroom, which is a story for another day all in itself. Maybe if there's a Ginsberg centenary, we'll have to anecdote about that. But several other poets of the Black Mountain.
Of course.
Williams, yeah, absolutely, yeah, Williams, who was, Gill's work was quoted in Williams's Patterson, so there was a close connection between Williams, who was Sorrentino's mentor in a sense, and Bob Creeley's.
Don't forget Duncan.
And Duncan, yeah, right. So, and I don't want to forget Duncan because I pulled him in earlier. And so, certainly the groundwork volumes, which I was really engaged with at that time. And I thought it was really interesting last night in the films and in the conversations about how Bob's readings were also conversations. And in my recollection, that's sort of how these seminars proceeded, that, he would read a bit from the poem and then he would discourse, they would kind of go off in different directions, and he would talk about the way that, these poets had influenced his own writing and his life, but never in a really authoritative way. And I was just so struck by this, here was a major American poet who, unlike all the other poets that I had encountered in the academy, did not teach verse writing, right? He taught the engagement with the poems themselves, and he largely allowed the students to hold forth. I mean, I think really, except for, a couple of drinks, right, Bob was fairly reticent. And so he didn't talk quite as much in these classes as you might expect for someone with that authority. And now, surprisingly, I have to talk also about cigarettes, right? Because even today, it's a 2-hour and 40-minute class. So there always had to be a break about halfway through the seminar. And it was at that point where the patting, the international signal of, do you have a smoke, would transpire at the break. And on at least one of these occasions, Bob and I are standing outside, and I don't smoke, so I couldn't help. But we're standing outside of Clements, because, it was like not so much in indoor smoking, but outdoor smoking. And we sort of observed the fact that smoking is like this incredibly dirty habit, in that every little piece of the cigarette paraphernalia, the matches in the matchbook, right, the cellophane from the cigarette pack, the cigarettes themselves, the butts when they'd been expended, all of them wind up on the ground. And so we were saying, it's kind of like a dirty habit, Bob. And I said, well, I never took up smoking because my mother, right, was like a 2-3 pack a day smoker when I was a child, and it repulsed me, and I famously, tried to bury her cigarettes out in the yard, got in trouble for that. And Bob looked at me and he said, I wish my mother were a smoker. Right, because then he would never have taken up this habit. Well, at that point, he was already experiencing symptoms of emphysema, and which would become worse over the remainder of his life. And so Penelope had strictly forbidden, right, the purchase, the possession, or the exhaling of cigarettes anywhere in the home, the firehouse, oddly enough, right? There was no smoke in the firehouse at all. And so that's why, in a sense, Bob needs to get cigarettes from his students, right, at the break of the seminars. And so he does the international signal, and one of the students says, Professor Creeley, cigarettes are expensive, and I can't afford to keep giving you cigarettes every week. And, Bob paused, and he looked down, and he had a kind of cloth satchel that he carried, his books, his lunch, etc. And he reached into the satchel, and he pulls out an apple. And he holds it out. And of course she declines. But that's the gift, right? I mean, week after week, in so many different ways, Bob Creeley offered his students a gift. It wasn't an imposition on their thought, it wasn't an imposition on their writing, it was his gift of himself and the company. And that's what I appreciated most about my experience with him as a teacher. Thank you.
I've been just thinking about what, if Penelope was here, what she would want to hear. I am a local. I grew up in the South Towns. Went to the University of Buffalo because it was the place that was the cheapest to go to school. I got to Buffalo and I was already considering myself a poet, but I didn't really know Bob's work. I knew Ginsberg really well, and I think into my second year here, I figured it out where I needed to be, which was to take classes with Creeley and with Jack Clark. So it was September 1st, 1987 that I had my first class with Bob, which was an undergraduate class called Intro to American Poetry, where he would bring in a boombox and a tape, and he would play recordings that he had found at the library of whatever he could find. So, like the 2 seconds of Whitman that was on the cylinder, and forward from there. I think it was like the same, this all on one day that I went to the first class, went to his office hours, introduced myself, asked if I could sit in on the graduate class, ended up in that class as well. And then for the next 4 months, I just followed him from place to place. So I would go to the undergrad class, go to his office, watch him eat lunch, and then go to the graduate class and watch people smoke. What is remarkable to me thinking about it now is how much, and I think this is like, if I wanted to talk about any characteristic of anyone's relationship with Bob, that sense of wanting to be in company and this idea of the down home. And I had no interest in academia. I had no interest in being a professional poet. I wanted to be a poet, but I didn't know what, professional was something else. And I said to him when I first met him, I'm going to take like a writing workshop with whoever the guy was, I'm not going to say his name, teaching writing workshops. And he said, oh no, that's like a really bad idea. He said, you should take history classes and you should study languages. I was like, oh, interesting. And that's what I did. And then from then on, we were just friends, which is also remarkable to me because I was 19 and I hadn't published anything particularly. I was editing a little magazine called No Trees, which he kind of picked up on and started sending people my way to, like a poem came in the mail from Ed Sanders, and I was like, oh, holy shit. So the connection with Duncan was also super important in that time period because in that class on Duncan Olson Creeley, he read the first thing he read the first day was the Venice poem. And I was not keen on Duncan. I thought Duncan was, compared to Ginsberg, was doing something way too romantic, and there was too many roots and branches and trees. I was just like, I can't do this. And he read the Venice poem, which was a very foreign creature to me. And all he could say about it, as the guy in charge, was, isn't that gorgeous? I was like, well it is. I'm not sure why. But for me, that was the beginning of I wanted to know everything I could about Robert Duncan's work. So I just took off on that path because it was there, and it really corresponded to my sense of if I can learn this stuff because I deeply want to, I will. And over the years, that friendship just continued. Thinking of, we were talking about being Buffalonians over on the side of the table, and I was thinking of my last email from Bob. I was living in London, and he sent me the weather report from Hamburg, where my dad was living. And he was reading Snowbound by John Greenleaf Whittier. It's just like, I think there's just so much to miss about the presence, the immediacy, what he would call the real of being able to, the Duncan line, having the ability to respond over time. And I certainly think of this when I think about continuing relationships for me with Penn and the kids, that he just set up all of these constellations and all of these networks for us to be here. So, thank you.
I heard from, I think, Liz and Joseph using the word permission and feeling permitted. And that feeling has come back to me when I reflect on meeting Bob Creeley for the first time in 1999. I was 18 years old, and I just walked out of a movie theater downtown, whatever it's called now. I think it just reopened. You know the one. I'd seen Buena Vista Social Club with my friend Michael Slozik, also a poet. And we walk out of the theater, and Bob is standing there with a pen. And I was starstruck in a way that he would just be standing there. It never occurred to me that he, I knew he lived in Buffalo, but that I would actually run into him that way. I was a freshman at Canisius College. I reluctantly signed on as a part-time student for one semester. I'll get to that in a little bit maybe. But I see Bob, and the first thing I say, I introduce myself, and I'm not a big person to walk up to somebody and introduce myself that way, but I just felt compelled. And there's a warmth about him for sure that I think anyone who knew him can relate to. And I think I just said, I write poetry and I'm a big fan of your work. And instantly he just said, oh, you should email me and we'll get together and, we'll get together for coffee sometime and you can show me some of your poems. Which is kind of beyond, your wildest imagination as a young person to be given that permission that you can enter this tradition with wherever you are. And that was wild. And the reason I recognized him to begin with was because of this thing that had been built, not just by him, but by a lot of people in this room and a lot of people who aren't in this room and are with us anymore. My next door neighbor growing up, a guy named Tom Joyce, had introduced me to poetry, discovering that I was interested in literature as a young person, 14, 15 years old. He turned me on to all kinds of art and poetry. He treated me like an adult. I joined a writing group that he had with other, kids my age. And then when I washed up at Canisius, by that point, I spent my senior year of high school in Germany as an exchange student, and I just had a feeling that no college could teach me what I had just learned. I went and explained that to a high school teacher of mine, and he was scandalized by the idea that I wasn't going to go to college. Because, he had taught a great poetry class, Jack Kenny. When I was a junior, and he loved the discussions we had in class at the time. And I don't know if his direct relationship to Creeley at all, maybe there was one, but being of this town, this is a place that treats poetry seriously. And that just carried forward. So that's why and then again, my first semester at Canisius, I took 2 classes, creative writing and, it doesn't matter. And the professor was someone who had studied under Creeley at UB. Mark Hammer, I haven't seen him in decades, but I think he was one of the organizers for the poetry series that Liz mentioned at the CPG. Yeah. Because he would talk about that.
Red flannel. I think he's here.
He's here?
Is he here?
That'd be great. No way.
Yeah, no way.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark.
Someone standing here.
So that was just a wild thing, and I was, after meeting Bob, I just resolved to, what am I doing at Canisius? And I think even Mark just said, yeah, what are you doing here? You should go to UB, and it was a lot cheaper. I got a Pell Grant to go to UB. It was a no-brainer. And what luck to walk into that situation. A few months back, we had, like Jim and others had, Mike Basinski at the Poetry Library talking about his, a generation before me, his discovery of the UB English program and the impact it had on him. And what luck it is to, and I know Bob Pohl has a similar story, what luck it is to have that, that public resource in your own backyard that you would just kind of stumble into and encounter. And of course, by the time I got there, Creeley was done teaching classes. But, who wasn't was Charles over here. And I took every class I could with him every semester. And just a lovely thing to do. And I remember the first time meeting with Creeley and going over my poems, and it just kind of embarrasses me to think about it now, and going over, my handwritten poems out of my notebook that I thought were very inspired and great, and him using words like, "Oh, this is useful," It just opened so many doors for me. And the number one thing, the last time I saw Bob was actually in this building. I brought this with me. There was an exhibition for Denny Moore's photographs that were on the cover of many New Directions books of poetry in the 90s.
On display at Black Rock Arts.
Is that right? Great. Thank you. I wanted to make it over there. Thanks, Jim. It was the thing that always struck me with Bob was this sense of joy that there was to be found in putting words on paper and making them sound a certain way. And that's what it's always been about for me, this kind of magical thing that happens when you write a poem, when you write it all, when you put language together, when you make language that way. And that's, just to end where I began. That's why I'm so happy that this is happening right now. And I just want to thank everyone for making it happen.
One of the things Bob taught me was that attention is the purest form of prayer. And I think that his presence is felt in this room tonight, and the presence that he offered all of us as individuals, 19-year-olds introducing themselves. And I remember him saying, if the Paris Review offers me for a poem, but I've promised that poem for a public newspaper or a high school literary magazine, they always get first dibs. I don't sell out for like the highest bidder. They come in the order received, and everyone gets in line the same way. That's always stuck with me, not just as an idea for publishing poetry, but as an idea of being in the world. And I honestly didn't know Bob as a poet at first. I was at this sort of Deweyan-inspired school in Vermont, where I live now. And I was interested in painting and sculpture, and I really liked the way that, Bob and his friends, Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery wrote about art. They wrote about art in a way that I understood, and in a way that a lot of, more traditional art historians were just kind of a little slow on the delivery. And they just really got to the point. And the writing itself was interesting. The way that Bob could put together a sentence in that note on Franz Klein, for example, it just, wow, it really blew my mind. So I was taking this sculpture class, and fortunately, Bob was actually the third professor I had who went to Black Mountain College. I was taking a sculpture class with the second professor I had met. And one day, we went to class, we were all smoking. And standing around in the morning, and, okay, John, what are we gonna do today? He said, well, there's an essay called Projective Verse. I'd like you to all go home, read this essay, and then I'd like you to build it in a three-dimensional form. tough assignment, right? So, needless to say, I started reading Charles Olson and learned more about Creeley and Ashbery and O'Hara as not only wonderful art critics, but as poets. And I never turned in my homework for the sculpture class, but I did find that letterpress printing, which is what I learned from my first Black Mountain professor, was, for me, a way of incorporating sculpture, because it's physical, with words, because it's typographic, which is inherently visual. So for me, that was, fireworks were going off. And through some fluke, acquired a letterpress, and I started printing things. And through a fluke, just reading the local news, I saw, wow, Robert Creeley's coming to Vermont Studio Center. It's only half an hour away or so. So somehow, maybe this is like actually when they had phone books, right? So somehow I looked up Bob's phone number, and I'm 20, and I call him on the phone, and I said, Bob, I hear that you're coming to Vermont to be a poet in residence at Vermont Studio Center. I wonder if you'd like to come to my college and do a reading. And he said, yeah, sure, absolutely. What's the honorarium? I said, Ben, go get a dictionary. I don't know what an honorarium is. So anyways, I said, okay, he wants money. I said, I'll get back to you, Bob. So I call him back after, rustling up $50. Because we didn't have like deans and stuff. This is like a hippie school.
You should say the name of the school.
The school is Goddard College, yeah. And so anyways, I called back Bob, and I said, my friends and I got $50 together. And he said, fantastic. I read there in 1962, and I got $50. So we set a date, and I get in my pickup truck. I've got this little pickup truck, and I drive out to pick up Bob. And I get him, and he's like, "Oh, thank God! This place is so boring. I've just been sitting around here by myself. There's nothing to do. Happy to get out of the house." So we drive and we talk, and I offer him one of those little Camel cigarettes that I've seen him smoking at Black Mountain College, and thank God he had quit at that time. And we go and we walk around campus, and I take him down to my print shop, thinking, this is the editor of the Black Mountain Review. He's going to be so psyched to see that we're doing this. And he said, "No offense, Kyle, but why in the world are you making books on a letterpress? If we had the Electronic Poetry Center, when I was at Black Mountain College, we would have saved a lot of time." So he was very forward-thinking, not nostalgic. I mean, he is nostalgic, but practical. And he gave a wonderful reading that night. We got this collection. He selected this collection of poetry edited by Louis Untermeyer, and really gave us a history lesson that night. He read some from his own work, but more, classic British verse. And it was just an unforgettable evening. We got totally lost going home, and the ride that should have been like half an hour turned out to be 3. And he was cool as a cat. Fast forward a little bit, I took a job as a high school English teacher, and I was terrible at it. I see kids running down the hall, and in a high school, you're supposed to stop. You have attention. But from my Deweyan perspective, I think these kids just need more exercise. They're not doing anything wrong. They're having fun. I want to run, And Bob says, so how's it going out there? And I tell him what's going on. And he said, well, maybe you would enjoy teaching college better. So I filled out the form and, ostensibly came up here to work with him the following year. And he really nourished my interest in the art of the book and the art of collaboration. And with Jim and Bob Bertolf and Michael Baczynski, I fell into this endless supply of first editions in English and in archives, and just, I haven't gotten out of the rabbit hole since. And found a letterpress in the art department where we saw that beautiful exhibition of Bob's books today. So really the whole trajectory of my life changed by that chance meeting. And, and just in closing, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, what brought me to Goddard and to John Dewey was this book by John Taylor Gatto called The 7 Lesson School Teacher. Dumbing Us Down. And it opens with a chapter called The 7 Lesson School Teacher. And this chapter is about not the lessons that we learn in the classroom, but the embodiment of the lessons that our teachers teach us. And, off the top of my head, modesty, generosity, patience, inquiry, curiosity, and above all, presence. So I thank Bob for teaching me those lessons and so many more, not through his words, but his way of being in the world. Thank you.
So Robert Creeley was not what I expected. When I came to Buffalo from the Bay Area in 1992, I was leaving a poetry community that had multiple scenes, each with its own hierarchy and inner circles, and conversation across generations was often very vexed. So also thinking about, for instance, the circle around Robert Duncan. I knew I had some friends with people that were in that circle, but I never managed to enter that circle. And the one time that I interacted with Duncan, who was a hero of mine, and whose work I still revere, it left a really bad taste in my mouth. It was just not very pleasant. And so when I left, I told my friends, and only half jokingly, I'm gonna go to Buffalo, and I'm gonna live there for 4 years, and I'm not even gonna cross paths with Robert Creeley. And I laugh now, just first of all thinking that I would finish my PhD in 4 years. But that's another story. But there was a certain realism in what I said about Creeley, because I didn't want to be disappointed, because I held his work in too high a regard, and I knew it very well. One of the last things I did when I was living in California, I made a bootleg Charles Olson reader for my friends who mostly didn't like Olson, as a way to sort of win them over. And it was anonymous because it was a bootleg. And so very soon after I got here, I just, on a whim, I slipped a copy into Creeley's mailbox. And to my shock, he asked around and found out that I had done it. And he called me at home and he said, I've edited the selected poems of Charles Olson for UC Press. Would you help me proofread it? And so my plan not to meet him crumbled immediately. And I had been a legal proofreader in San Francisco, and for all I know, Bob had found that out too. So I went to his house a couple of times at the firehouse, and we sat at a table, and he had the printouts set out, and I would proofread it. And while I did that, he would tell stories and talk about Charles Olson. And we would exchange some ideas about what a selected poem should do. And he had received criticism from the reader reports for UC for some of his inclusions and exclusions, he told me. And it happened that in my bootleg reader, I had made some of the same choices. So he was talking to me as if we were co-conspirators, which was amazing, and humbling. And so it continued like that. The other thing that really surprised me about it, and again, I think this is just the after effect of my Bay Area life, he was just not hagiographic at all when he talked about Olson. And in the Bay Area, poets were dogmatic about their commitments, and there was, a way to see it. And, it was clear that Creeley was devoted to Olson and felt a responsibility to upkeeping his memory. But he didn't feel responsible to any one version of Olson, and that really surprised me. And it was borne out even more profoundly later when he wrote the preface to Tom Clark's biography of Charles Olson, which every other Olsonian I know, despises this book. And it's just that wasn't his attitude about that. And I would learn over the years about other figures as well. Could talk about a little bit about with Williams, for instance, who I thought was maybe the most revered figure for him. So, and also when we were doing the copy editing, like he felt, he acknowledged a strong debt to George Butterick, who had produced all of the posthumous editions of Olson. But he didn't feel responsible for making the same choices or following Butterick's choices. So he went out of his way to ask for a different page size and typeface for the selected poems. The Butterick editions were these massive, large books, and the one that Creeley made was a pocket-sized one. And because he wanted an Olson that was at a human scale, not at an epic scale. And that was very moving to me. To see, first of all, because it was so starkly different from my past experience, but also just in general as a matter of principle that he was interested in divergent perspectives and was actually seeking new perspectives. I think his curiosity and his desire to talk to young people, was a reflection of that. I always felt at Clemens Hall that he was always, he would much rather be talking to the high school students in Buffalo than to the graduate students. It was just, he was drawn where he was going to get a fresh perspective. And I realize also retrospectively that it's really tied to a certain restlessness in his own poetry and a continual evolution of the form and feeling of what he writes. And clearly he had his commitments and he had his touchstones and his things that he returned to. And his thoughts about them would change and evolve, but not that much. But it wasn't that you had to see them the same way. And I think one of the things I took from him is that the commitments you have, they create a context in which you think and you feel and you act and you practice your art. And it's that creation of a context, which I guess is, and that's another one of his words, context. But that's what company, there's a way in which the company turns into a tradition and it solidifies. And whereas a context is constantly evolving and accommodating new people, and people who enter into it because you uphold it then develop their own attitudes toward it, and that's what community is. And that's something that's probably the teaching of Creeley that has stuck with me. And that's certainly something that I've tried to emulate in my own teaching and writing is to try to, when possible, be welcoming to new perspectives and, share my take and let everyone else have theirs. And that's how I think of him.
Yeah.
So for those who may not know, it's worth mentioning that Charles Olson taught at SUNY Buffalo for 2 years.
Right.
And it brings to mind also that I want to mention Al Cook, because Al Cook is the reason that, many of us are here. And Al Cook's idea was to hire people at a time when you could more easily just make decisions without the kind of a superstructure. And he hired a bunch of poets and novelists to teach in a PhD program and to teach literature in an undergraduate program. And so the core concept of the Poetics program as we developed it, when I came, and Susan Howe, Dennis Tedlock, and Raymond Fetterman, was that we would be poets or teaching teaching literature, and that actually completely different than the model of the creative writing program. I'm grateful to have been brought into that. It's also interesting to see that Liz then went on to direct and become part of the Iowa Writers Workshop because of the way in which that principle, bore fruit. Now, maybe mention also here in terms of, because I'm so absorbed as is Susan Howe and thinking of those, that original Poetics program, the Pulitzer Prize for Juliana, who was very much a star for her book Ars Poetica, also available at Talking Leaves Books. Because there was one of our company, and it's a prize for the whole group, really, in a sense. And it's a very surprising thing that could have happened, or many of the other things that we're talking about. This was my job at Buffalo was really, strangely, my first real job. I always say I paid more in taxes that first year than I had ever made in my life. And at that time, I wasn't great. But by the time I left, I definitely had turned great, though I have never read David Gray's poems. So as Suki says, I call Susan Howe Suki, when I came here, really Penn, Will, and Hannah became, and Bob was a home away from home for Susan, for me, and for Emma, and was very transformative. A couple of people talk about the teaching. So he didn't teach really after I arrived, have to teach. He did sometimes teach, and I always had him come into my classes, which was interesting because I am a totally different method of teaching, and I would, just like I'm doing now, explain things. Maybe I am the village explainer that Richard Stein said at Pound. And Bob did not like meta discourse, he didn't like to explain, just you did what you did. But one interesting way to look at that teaching, because I saw what happened when undergraduates and graduates came in, is that he didn't like syllabi, for example, because how could you know what you were going to do next week until you knew what happened the week before? So anything could happen. That sense of openness was very deep in his, and he's right about that. It isn't possible to do it, and I certainly prepared myself months ahead and put them online, but I was very taken. And when he would speak, he would just start to tell stories, and one story was not obviously connected to the next. They were contingent, but they were a set of anecdotes. And I think a lot of the people who came ready for a class just didn't understand what he was doing and dropped away. But then the group that stayed were totally transformed in their lives, because after a while, and also you could always ask him, who is Charles? Charles also, or maybe me. So living and teaching anecdotally, and also, just the intensity of the long conversations with him. We would speak for hours at the firehouse and go anywhere. And I love this particular book, A Quick Graph. It's an enormous influence to me when I first started to read Creeley, who I read first through the recommendation of Robin Blazer in 1973 when I was in British Columbia. A quick graph is very much, what I have always been trying to do, and certainly it's what Language Magazine was. You put together things provisionally as a constellation, and that provisionality was certainly fundamental. I always resisted the idea of, odd as I know it is to say, but families, and I am part of a family, groups, and I'm part of many groups. But still, I had this ambivalence, a lot of poets had, but especially that idea of the company of this group of poets, and that sort of knew each other and so on. And I have to say, I am part of Bob's company, and I do have that transmission, and it is hand to hand. And for whatever else, I saw the problem of it as being exclusionary, but the comments here make me absolutely aware of something I always knew, but I couldn't have said because I came to Bob in a different way. It wasn't exclusionary, but it was a company and it was personal, that you met and interacted with people, and then you spent the rest of your life staying in conversation if possible. In the Richard O. Moore wonderful film, Poetry USA, which is on Penn Sound, you can see that, as well as he talks about when he was young and he was in Europe, his glass eye fell on the floor. And he says, my eye was broken on the floor. My eye was broken on the floor. And it's when I heard that again at the Anthology of Film Archive showing, it's just that this is actually perfect for what Bob is. Both the eye, but also himself was broken. And this is what Susan Howe means by Art Crane's brokenness. And it is a condition not just of Bob. And that other famous line in that sense, was that a real poem? Or did you just make it up? I was also thinking, because I was asked to speak at the anthology, and we had that fantastic Brakhage film of the relation of Brakhage to Creeley, because it's something a little bit different than we've been talking about, and Brakhage certainly appreciated that. Brakhage is famous for, and I think it's an interesting parallel, Brakhage is famous for saying, the art of seeing with one's own eyes. So with one's own eyes, I think of the act of thinking with one's own mind, and also the act of feeling with one's own language. With Creeley, you're always aware that you're reading a poem, what Williams called a small or large machine made of words. You hear the words in the echo as they become acoustic sounds that bounce off of each other. And you discover in that dewy way the poem in writing, not putting a prior idea into writing. I love this, actually in the film, Will reads this section. There is no one here but words, no thing but echoes. I mean, this is certainly my Poetics, but it remains a very radical thing within a very kind of empirical, object-oriented conception of what poems are. Also, two final points. One of which is to say how crucial he was for the development of both the Electronic Poetry Center, which, he actually said to Colin, also Penn Sound. And I won't go into that, but you wouldn't have those two things without his support and understanding of what we were trying to do. I think of the line breaks, which are the enjambment, as a kind of quantum poetics, because they appear to fracture and make abstract the lines. But when you hear it, it's a sight of a cathected break that connects the two. So it both makes for a radical, emotional, and affective connection, but at the same time, it's disjunct. And this ability to be disjunct and super connected is so important to what he's doing. Isaac mentioned the famous Robert Duncan line, responsibility is the ability to respond. I've been thinking a lot about Bob and male consciousness and how important he was for writing about male feelings in the 50s, but also later, which were not happy, but nobody really put so vividly, and not exemplary, not something to follow, but you can't break from those things unless you hear it. And so I would say this in ending about Bob work, and it's vulnerability. That vulnerability is the ability to be vulnerable. Thanks.